Welcome back, everyone. We've got a really interesting deep dive ahead of us today, all about patient and resident rights in long-term care.
Yeah, this should be a good one.
So we're going to be looking at all sorts of things like essential terminology, legal frameworks, and the role of nurse assistants in this whole world. It's going to be fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. I think unpacking not just what these rights are, but, like why they matter so much, especially when we're talking about a population that often relies on others, for so much.
Exactly. I mean, that's what makes this so important, right? So, to get us started, let's jump right into the list of key terms we pulled out. I think one that really stood out to me was mandated reporter. What
Yes.
does that actually mean, like, in the context of long-term care
Oh, well,
facilities?
that's a great place to start. So a mandated reporter, in the simplest terms, is anyone who is legally obligated to report any suspected abuse or neglect.
Oh, wow.
It means that nurse assistants, they're not just caregivers, they're also like watchdogs protecting resident rights.
That's a big responsibility, right?
It is.
And then on top of that, we've got all these other kind of complex terms. You also flagged informed consent, DNR no code, and advanced directives.
Right.
What makes these so critical in this setting?
I think about it this way. These terms, they're all about giving residents a voice,
Yeah.
even when they might not be able to speak up in the same way, they could before.
Right.
So informed consent, that ensures that they understand and agree to any procedures,
Yeah.
medical procedures.
Yeah.
DNR no code,
Yeah.
that clarifies their wishes about resuscitation.
Okay.
And then advanced directives, those outline, like their preferences for care if they can't make those decisions themselves anymore.
Wow, that's a lot to think about.
It is.
It really is all about making sure that their autonomy is respected even as they might need more help with their daily living, right? And speaking of that, I'm also curious about the whole purpose of long-term care facilities, beyond just providing like housing or a place to stay. Your notes really seem to suggest it's much more than that.
Oh, absolutely. It's about a holistic approach to care.
Hmm.
We're talking about providing physical care, sure, but also like preventing illness, and injury, promoting recovery, really helping residents reach their full potential.
Their full potential.
Yes, both physically and mentally. It's a real delicate balance between care and empowerment.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of empowerment a little bit more. You highlighted the nurse assistant's role in maintaining rights, and it sounds like they're really, they're on the front lines of this whole ensuring resident well-being.
Oh, they are. They are. They're often the ones who are interacting with residents the most,
Right.
day in and day out. So their understanding of resident rights is absolutely vital. They're not just providing, that physical care. They're advocating for the resident, making sure their voice is heard, really recognizing them as individuals with rights, not just patients needing care.
It's like being that ally for them, right?
Yeah.
That trusted person who can really make a difference, especially when they might be feeling vulnerable or dependent on others.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move into the kind of legal framework that governs all of this. I saw that you marked some pretty dense sections, from both California and federal regulations.
Yeah, we've got California Code of Regulations, Title 22, Division 5, Chapter 3,
Okay.
and then Federal Title 42, Code of Federal Regulations 483.10. It sounds intimidating, but it's all about setting those standards for care and defining resident rights.
Right, so it's important stuff. And it's interesting because, California often has its own set of regulations, like going above and beyond the federal requirements.
That's right.
Why is that? What kind of impact does that have for residents who are in these California facilities?
Well, California is always, they've been really progressive when it comes to patient care. They're always pushing for a higher standard of well-being for residents.
Okay.
It could be because, there's a lot of strong advocacy here,
Mhm.
or maybe it's because they've been proactive in the past, in addressing issues in long-term care.
Right.
Whatever it is,
Right.
this commitment definitely translates to stronger protections for those living in facilities here.
That makes sense.
Now, the specifics might be different between the state and federal, regulations, but ultimately they both emphasize those core principles: informed consent, freedom from restraints, the right to manage their own finances, privacy, visitation rights, all of that.
So it's like a safety net,
It is.
making sure that residents have that agency, that control over their own life as much as possible.
Exactly.
But of course, there are always going to be those situations where those rights might need to be balanced with their safety or the safety of others, right? That's where things can get, a little bit trickier.
Absolutely. It's this constant navigation, you know. We're trying to provide care while also upholding their autonomy.
Right.
And that's why we really need to be clear about that line between negligence and abuse. You know, the source material really emphasized that.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. What are those key differences, those distinctions, between negligence and abuse in a long-term care setting?
Well, negligence is more about failing to provide proper care, and often, it's unintentional.
Okay.
Abuse is a deliberate act that's intended to cause harm.
So it's really about intent.
Yeah, that's a key difference. Imagine, the impact that each type of abuse can have. Physical abuse, you see the marks, right?
Yeah.
But then you have verbal abuse that can, chip away at someone's self-worth.
Oh, wow.
Or financial abuse, which can strip them of their independence.
So we're talking about really serious, long-lasting consequences. Can you give us like a quick overview of the specific types of abuse that the source material highlights?
Sure. So they outline 5 main types: physical, verbal, psychological, sexual, and financial. And remember, abuse doesn't always have to be this big, obvious thing. It can be really subtle.
Right.
And vulnerable residents, they might not always feel comfortable speaking up. So it's really important for staff to be extra vigilant, to recognize those signs.
Oh, I see what you mean. So that adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. What should a nurse assistant do, if they see something or even just suspect something's wrong?
Simple. Report it.
Just report it.
Nurse assistants, they're mandated reporters. Remember that. They are legally and ethically obligated to bring any concerns forward.
So if you see something, say something.
Exactly. It's not about, playing detective and figuring out who's guilty or anything. It's about making sure the situation is looked into.
Okay, so err on the side of caution.
Yes. The source material even mentioned aiding and abetting.
Yeah.
Even if you're not directly involved, if you see abuse and do nothing, you're part of the problem.
That's a powerful reminder that we all have a responsibility here.
We do.
Silence can be just as harmful. Okay, and what about the residents themselves? What options do they have if they feel like their rights have been violated?
The source material talked about grievances. Residents have every right to file a formal complaint if they believe something's wrong. It's all about empowering them to advocate for themselves.
Okay, so there are systems in place to make sure their voices are heard. This is already, shedding so much light on all of these different aspects of long-term care.
It is.
But before we move on, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier, this connection between patient rights and, what was it, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, absolutely. Think of Maslow's hierarchy, like building a house. You need that solid foundation before you can do all the fancy stuff.
Yeah.
In long-term care, each level of that hierarchy, it directly connects to a specific patient right.
Oh, interesting. So like, for example?
Well, take the need for food and water. Right.
Yeah.
That relates to a resident's right to proper nutrition and hydration.
Makes sense.
Or the need for safety and security.
Yeah.
That connects to their right to be in a clean, safe environment, free from abuse.
Okay, I see the connection.
And then as you go up that pyramid, the need for belonging and love,
yeah,
that's about visitation rights, being able to communicate with loved ones, and then self-esteem. That's about being treated with dignity, having your individuality valued.
Wow, that is fascinating.
It is.
It really helps us see how meeting those basic needs is absolutely crucial, to a resident's overall well-being and sense of dignity.
Right.
But what about the very top of the pyramid, self-actualization? What does that even look like in a setting like this?
That's a great question. I think it's about supporting residents to reach their full potential, whatever that means for them.
Okay.
Maybe it's encouraging them to, keep up with their hobbies, providing opportunities for social interaction, helping them achieve those personal goals. It's recognizing that even in long-term care, they can still grow and learn and contribute.
Right. Life doesn't just stop.
Exactly. It just takes on a different form.
That's a powerful way to think about it. It's about making sure everyone has that right to experience joy, fulfillment, and a sense of purpose. But how do we actually put this into practice,
Right.
What are some concrete things that nurse assistants can do to uphold these rights in those everyday interactions with residents?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, and it's a perfect way to transition to the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, well, we'll have to hold that thought and pick it up in part 2. Thanks for joining us so far, everyone.
So we were talking about how nurse assistants can really make a difference in, upholding residents' rights. And a lot of it comes down to those, everyday interactions and actions.
It's those small things that can actually have a big impact.
Right? Those meaningful gestures.
Right.
It starts with like simple things, like treating residents with respect and dignity.
Yeah.
Calling them by their preferred name, knocking before entering their room, asking for consent before providing care. These all might seem small,
Right.
but they can really foster a sense of autonomy and control.
It's about recognizing that they're individuals.
Exactly. Not just, patients.
Yeah.
And then there's communication. Really taking the time to listen, to understand their needs, their preferences, to involve them in those decisions about their care.
Making them an active participant rather than, just a passive recipient.
Exactly. And encouraging them, to participate in activities, engage with their community, keep up with their hobbies, whatever their interests are. It all goes back to supporting their right to a full and meaningful life.
It's about seeing the whole person.
Yeah, exactly. And then, nurse assistants can really be powerful advocates for residents.
Right.
If you see something that's not right, speak up.
Yeah.
If a resident is expressing concerns, listen and take action. Be their champion. Be their voice if they need one.
That's so important. Speaking of speaking up, let's go back to those types of abuse that we talked about earlier. I think it'd be helpful to go into each category a little deeper.
Yeah.
Let's start with physical abuse. What are some of those red flags that, nurse assistants should be watching out for?
So physical abuse, it's any, non-accidental act that causes pain or injury.
Okay.
Hitting, slapping, pushing, kicking, even using restraints inappropriately.
Wow.
But it's important to remember that sometimes physical harm can be unintentional too.
Really?
It can come from negligence.
Okay, so can you give me like an example of that?
Sure. Say you have a resident who's bedridden
Uh-huh.
and you fail to reposition them regularly.
Okay.
That can lead to bed sores.
Oh,
And that's a form of physical harm, even though it's from, neglecting a basic care need.
so it's not always about someone intentionally trying to hurt them. It can be, from not providing that proper care or attention.
Exactly. And then you've got verbal abuse, which, can be more subtle, but just as damaging.
Yeah.
It's using words to, demean or threaten or control someone.
So we're talking about yelling, insults, threats, even isolating a resident from others.
Yep. All of those things create like a really hostile environment.
Yeah.
It can be emotionally damaging.
Okay. And then we have psychological or emotional abuse. And gosh, that must be like really hard to detect, right?
It can be. It's
Yeah.
about, inflicting mental anguish.
Okay.
So things like humiliation, intimidation, manipulation, all of that falls under this umbrella.
Wow.
It might not leave a physical mark,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it can be really devastating. It erodes their self-esteem, their sense of security.
Mm.
It's tough to think about. But these are all real things that happen.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And then there's sexual abuse.
Right. Any kind of non-consensual sexual contact. It's a really sensitive issue, especially in these settings where residents are, particularly vulnerable.
Absolutely.
It's awful, but we have to talk about it. And finally, financial abuse.
Right. That's, the illegal or improper use of residents' funds, their assets.
So we could be talking about anything from outright theft
Uh-huh.
to more subtle forms of, manipulation, like forcing them to sign over a power of attorney or something.
Exactly. Financial abuse is all about, taking advantage of someone for your own gain. And it's important to remember that residents have the right to manage their own money.
Right.
And they need to be protected from this kind of exploitation.
Okay. So that brings us back to the importance of reporting, mandatory reporting. If a nurse assistant suspects any of this, it's their legal obligation to come forward.
You're right. And they need to know the proper channels and procedures for doing that.
Absolutely. The source material also mentioned that residents have the right to file grievances. Those formal complaints if they feel like their rights have been violated.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a two-pronged approach, right?
It is.
Staff are legally obligated to report, but residents also have that power to raise concerns themselves.
Exactly. And those grievances, they need to be taken seriously. They need to be thoroughly investigated. The source material even mentioned the Ombudsman program.
Oh, yeah. Can you explain what that is for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. So an ombudsman, they're like an advocate for residents in long-term care facilities. They help residents understand their rights, navigate the system, resolve complaints.
It's like having someone in their corner,
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we were talking about,
Uh-huh.
I think it's really cool how the source material use that to show how fulfilling those basic needs is tied to those patient rights.
At first, I have to admit, I wasn't sure how those two connected. But the more we talk about it, the more I see how, like, each level of that pyramid can be linked to a specific right.
Yeah, it's about building that foundation. You can't build a house without a solid base.
Right.
And you can't ensure a resident's well-being without meeting those basic needs. Safety, security, belonging, esteem.
That makes total sense. Okay, so we've covered those basic patient rights, the legal stuff, types of abuse reporting, the ombudsman. Anything else we need to hit before we wrap this up?
One thing I think is really important to remember is that all of this isn't just about avoiding legal trouble.
Yeah.
It's not about checking boxes. It's about creating a culture of respect and dignity.
Within the facility.
Yes, it's about going beyond just following the rules.
Right. It's about that mindset shift, right?
It is. It is.
From just providing care to really advocating for their well-being, for their empowerment.
Exactly. It's about seeing each resident, as an individual, someone with their own unique needs and preferences, with a story to tell.
And making sure they feel valued and respected.
Exactly. And empowered to, live their best life.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it for now. It's amazing how much ground we've covered.
I know, right?
We started with just, defining legal terms, and now we're really talking about, the essence of what long-term care should be all about. This deep dive has been, well, eye-opening, to say the least.
It has. We've gone from, the letter of the law to the, spirit of it all, that compassionate care.
Exactly.
And that reminds me of something I saw in the materials you gave me, this idea of, promoting a culture of respect and dignity in these facilities.
Right. It's about going beyond just the rules and regulations.
Yes, exactly. It's about creating that feeling, that atmosphere where residents feel valued, where they feel empowered.
So they feel safe and heard and respected.
Right. Like they have a say in their own lives.
Autonomy. That's huge, right?
So it is.
Even in a long-term care setting, I remember reading about informed consent in those documents. Can you remind us what that means and why it's so important?
Sure. So informed consent, it's all about making sure that residents, they understand and they agree to any medical procedures or treatments.
Okay.
It gives them the power to make decisions about their own bodies, their own health care. It's respecting their right to choose, even if those choices are tough or maybe even different from what the doctors recommend.
Wow. So it's really acknowledging that they're the ones who make the final call when it comes to their own care. What happens when a resident can't make those decisions?
Right.
You mentioned advanced directives before.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course. So advanced directives, they're like, legal documents.
Okay.
They outline a person's wishes for their care if they can't, make those decisions themselves.
Okay.
So if they get sick or, something happens where they're incapacitated.
Right.
These documents can include things like living wills.
Right.
Those specify their wishes regarding, life-sustaining treatment.
Oh.
Or they can have a durable power of attorney for health care.
Okay.
That's where they designate someone to make medical decisions on their behalf.
So it's like having a plan in place to make sure that their wishes are honored, even when they can't, say it themselves.
Exactly.
This deep dive has really shown how complex long-term care can be.
It is.
And just how important the role of the nurse assistant is in all of this.
Oh, for sure. They're on the front lines. They're not just providing the care, they're also advocating for those rights.
I keep thinking about what you said earlier about those little things, those small gestures that can make such a big difference.
Right.
Can you give some specific examples of how a nurse assistant can, really embody that culture of respect, in those day-to-day interactions?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts with just treating each resident like a person.
Right.
Calling them by their name, asking about their day, taking an interest in their hobbies, or what they did before. Little things like that.
Just those little acts of kindness.
Yeah. And it also means respecting their space, their privacy. Knock before you go in, ask permission before you, do something for them. Make sure their things are handled carefully. It's all about acknowledging their independence, even in those basic things.
It's amazing how these simple actions can have such a big impact.
They do. And it's also about letting residents participate in their own care.
Yeah.
As much as they're able to. Encourage them to make choices about the routine, their meals, their activities, even, what they wear.
So they feel in control.
Right. And then also advocate for them. If you see something that's not right, speak up. If they've told you something's bothering them, address it. Just, be there for them.
Be that person they can trust.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered so much.
We have.
We've talked about those legal and ethical parts of patient rights, all those different types of abuse, and really focused on how important nurse assistants are in this whole process.
And we've learned that these rights, they're not just about, checking off boxes on a form.
Right.
It's about making sure that each resident has a life full of dignity and respect
Yeah.
and fulfillment.
Exactly. This has been such a valuable deep dive.
I agree. I hope our listeners feel like they understand these rights better and that they feel empowered to advocate for their protection.
Because at the end of the day, these rights are about, more than just policies and procedures. They're about human connection and compassion, that fundamental right to a good life.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you.
We hope you learned something new today and that you'll continue to explore this really important topic.
Remember, even the smallest actions can make a difference. A kind word, taking the time to listen, speaking up when something's wrong. These are all things that matter.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged,
Yeah.
and keep those conversations going.